Thank you very much, Ani, and it's great to have you all joining us today for a very exciting webinar. This is part of our continued commitment to bring to you the most innovative and cutting-edge technologies that could really have an impact on our community. And so today I'm really excited to have Daniel Lee, the CEO of Stat Health, join us. Daniel's background is incredibly impressive. He is a wearable engineer, and his last startup was focused, which was called Hush, appropriately, was really designed to address one of the issues that obviously our community also shares with this, which is unrefreshing sleep or disturbed sleep. And Daniel was targeting noise, and really came up with an innovative way to have a way to reduce the noise using an in-ear device. This was acquired by Bose, which I'm sure everyone knows, and Bose really used Daniel's technology to launch the Bose sleep buds. And really, Daniel left for a reason that I think I can really appreciate and applaud. And Daniel really wanted to work on something that was happening with his father, and this was a continuous fainting that led to falling. So that's how Stat Health started. And Daniel, we're very excited that you were joining us today, and please go ahead, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Ovid. It's nice to meet you all, and thanks for the kind intro. So, I mean, also, Ovid, if there's any points in the presentation you feel it would be helpful to like pause or ask a clarifying question, feel free to interject at any point. But today I'll be sharing a presentation, a little bit, it will be a little bit detailed around how our technology works, as well as some initial validation that we've done. But I may use certain terminology that may be confusing, so please do interject if I do so, Ovid. But all right, I will go ahead and get started here. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Cool. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So as you can see here, this is a Stat device. It sticks into this little nook in the ear. It's meant to be very discreet. You can leave it in 24/7, and we're continuously measuring blood flow to the head, but I'll get into this in a moment. First, I'll give a little bit more details on the backstory that Ovid touched upon, but basically, I was working at Bose. My dad had been falling for many years. He doesn't see his fall like a faint coming. He'll just be walking around and then suddenly wake up on the floor. And now a little more than 3.5 years ago now, he fell and broke 6 ribs, which is like around the time that also was around the time that I decided to leave Bose. And so that was a problem that was the most obvious for me and my co-founder, my co-founder's name is Paul. He was helping lead the health product innovation group at Bose with me. And so we both wanted to work on this problem. We want to see, is there something measurable that's happening with my father that before he passes out, that we can see it coming and maybe even give him a warning ahead of time? And so that's the initial kind of where we started. Now, when I was doing the research here, and when we're going to the doctors and we're going to the tilt tables, not everyone it was actually like my dad. They weren't necessarily older people that were struggling with like the fainting, falling issue as much. Most of the people on the tilt tables were actually much younger females that were, upon standing, having persistent dizziness. They actually weren't passing out very often, but they were having the continuous persisting dizziness issue. And that's where, that's kind of where we discovered the ME/CFS, POTS, now long COVID has really affected a lot more people with these types of disorders. And so that's where we kind of expand into who are we trying to help here. And so let's see here, my screen is acting funny. So we started expanding to not just fainting, but we're trying to look more into dizziness as well and chronic dizziness. I mean, I am sure that many of you are online in these very large Facebook patient support groups, but that was a very a treasure trove of information for us to really understand the experience of what everyone is going through. And like, so you can see Casey can barely take care of herself. Susanna says I can't keep feeling defeated because I can't complete the simplest of tasks without needing to sit or lie down. And I'm sure this is just preaching to the choir here. You're probably all very familiar with this. And then finally, there's also the fainting falling issue Ellen is experiencing, like my dad. Walking into a medical office building to see the doctor, I just fainted, fell, busted my forehead open, and had to get 9 stitches. Now I'm scared to go anywhere or do anything by myself. So these were kind of the buckets of people we wanted to help, but we've actually been more focused on more recently the chronic dizziness issue and trying to better understand blood flow to that as it relates to that. Just because the number of people that are actively wanting to use technology to help this is different than kind of the older population. So we want to get there, and we're going to want to help my father eventually. But right now, for multiple reasons, we're actually helping the dizziness as our first priority. Now, existing metrics often can't tell anything is wrong. So as you see Candace sharing, do you guys find that how you feel doesn't always correlate with your blood pressure? Anyone know why we feel bad if it's not blood pressure related? Because doctors don't really have an objective way to measure something that really strongly correlates with symptoms, patients are often told it's all in your head because there's not really good objective tools to prove there is. Now, the irony is that it is all in your head, literally. The reason that my dad passes out and why people feel these chronic dizziness issues is because when people stand up, so note the stick figure here, gravity pulls blood into your legs, so the blood doesn't make it back up to your heart. And if it doesn't make it back up to your heart, it's not going to get pumped to the brain. The heart has to be filled with blood, or else it's dry firing. It's like you can't, squeezing an empty sac isn't very effective to getting blood to your head. So you have to fill the heart with blood, and that's what's going on here. Now, one of the ways that your body will compensate is it'll try to increase the heart rate. So you can see even in this situation, the heart rate does increase, but that doesn't necessarily mean that more blood's flowing to your head, because it's the heart's not getting filled. And this can even happen while blood pressure looks very stable. Actually, this is more common than not, that blood pressure looks totally fine. But again, so if you're only looking at, and as if you see here, as soon as you lay back down, the blood's going to fill your heart again, and the blood flow to your head is going to restabilize. And you can note here that there's no drop in heart rate or blood pressure. To a physician, they'll look at heart rate and blood pressure only, and they'll assume heart rate went up, blood pressure went up, you must be getting more blood flow to your head. But unfortunately, that's a wrong assumption. And this has been demonstrated in thousands of patients at Harvard, at Johns Hopkins, in the Netherlands, at a number of different institutions that have already kind of demonstrated this phenomenon of the discordance of blood pressure, heart rate, and blood flow to your head, or cerebral blood flow. Now, you can see this quote from Johns Hopkins. This is from Dr. Peter Rowe, who's done a lot of good work in the ME/CFS community and research here. But CBF is a critical missing vital sign. It's not easy to measure CBF, so most clinics approximate using heart rate and blood pressure, which often mislead. So that's where, if you actually look at cerebral blood flow, it's already been demonstrated as a key biomarker for multiple diseases. So I mentioned the previous study was from Dr. Peter Novak at Harvard and Brigham, and he has been studying this on a lot of patients using TCD. He concludes it's essential to monitor cerebral blood flow in addition to blood pressure and heart rate. I'll get into the data a little bit more, but basically there's a very large percentage of the population that has normal heart rate, normal blood pressure, but blood flow that had cerebral blood flow is compromised. Same thing, Johns Hopkins, they use a little bit of a different technique where they measured total blood inflow using ultrasound probes on all of the arteries going into the head, not transcranial Doppler, which measures ultrasound through the skull of blood flow flowing through one of the arteries in your head. And I mean, they've showed that 90% of ME/CFS patients have an abnormal cerebral blood flow reduction. And I think 82% had, I forget the exact number, but they had normal hemodynamics with just heart rate and blood pressure, a large percentage of them. This has also been shown in long COVID. These are also the same groups, but this has been in a smaller data set. But let me just skip here to let you see some data. So you can see this is one of the studies across POTS, orthostatic hypotension, as well as just ME/CFS with normal heart rate and blood pressure. But you can see that compared to healthy controls, basically they look at your supine cerebral blood flow. So they lay you down, they tilt you up on the tilt table, and they see how much does your cerebral blood flow change, what percentage changes upon being tilted up. you can see that normal healthy people will have maybe a 6-7% drop in their cerebral blood flow. The ME/CFS patients have a 20 to 30% drop. Some of them have orthostatic hypotension, some of them have POTS, but even if they don't, you still have a drop in cerebral blood flow, and despite normal heart rate and blood pressure, shown in 429, actually way more than this, but this is what they published at the time. Here's another study that they did with the 10 long COVID patients. In 10 patients, they saw 33% drop in blood flow in long COVID patients. So they look very similar in nature to ME/CFS patients. And this is also another study from Harvard, from Dr. Novak, but you can see here the green line is the healthy controls for cerebral blood flow velocity. It's maintained pretty stable from supine to upright, but you can see both POTS and PASC, which is long COVID in blue. Red and blue have significant drops in the cerebral blood flow velocities. And so that's just pointing to some of the existing literature. Now that's where STAT comes in. So STAT is a discrete in-ear wearable that continuously monitors blood flow to the head 24/7. So we're trying to do continuous hemodynamics, not just blood flow to head, but we also have a heart rate and a blood pressure trend algorithm, which I'll explain a little bit. The way that it works is we target a very shallow ear artery. So you can actually see this. This is a cadaver ear that was like bleached and then like injected to make the artery more visible. But you can see that it's very shallow. This is very different than any other wearable that is trying to go through multiple layers of skin, muscle tissue, hair, etc. But we have a very shallow, very strong arterial signal, and we use infrared light to interrogate that artery and see flow changes. And that's some of the underlying technology, and I'll get into a little bit more later. Also, for those that are, actually, I'll get into the next slide. So what we're trying to build is, I think the way that we try to position it is what's continuous glucose monitors did for diabetics, where you give them the ability to measure what matters, which is blood glucose for diabetics. We want to do the same for cardiovascular disease, starting with orthostatic syndromes, primarily ME/CFS, POTS, long COVID, etc. Now, how does STAT measure blood flow to the head? So we call it blood flow to the head, which is a proxy for cerebral blood flow. All of the literature is talking about cerebral blood flow, but if you see here, we have, there's off of your, so from your heart, there's your main trunk of a blood vessel, which is your aorta. Off of that, there's a carotid that climbs up your neck, and it splits into your internal carotid artery and your external carotid artery. The internal carotid artery is the very dominant source of blood flow to your brain. And then the external carotid feeds like your face and your ear and some other locations. Now, the external carotid, actually, a part of it climbs out the back of the ear and pokes through the ear, and that's that artery that I shared in the earlier slide, and that's what we're measuring. But we're measuring flow changes in the external carotid, so not directly blood flow to the brain, but it's still blood flow to the head. And what we're trying to prove, and we have some literature, some existing data on, is it strongly correlates in when it's induced by orthostatic changes upon standing. And the reason for that is because orthostasis is upon standing. So upon standing, you have a drop in preload. So preload means how much your heart is filled with blood before it pumps, how much you preload it before you pump it. And because there's a drop in how much the heart is filled, there's a reduction in stroke volumes. That's when you pump, how much, in a single stroke, how much blood leaves the heart. So you have less blood leaving the heart with each stroke, or there's less output, cardiac output. And that's what causes the reduced blood flow to the head. So it's actually upstream of both of these arteries. That's what causes the blood flow to the head drop. It's not necessarily something going on inside of your brain. It's what's going to your brain. So it's a heart issue. So that's basically how our technology works. Is we're looking at blood flow changes in the external carotid artery and looking at how well that correlates with the internal carotid. And in most cases, that tracks actually really well. So you can see here, this is what the actual data looks like from the STAT device. This is a raw actual pulsatile waveform of what's hitting the ECA. And you can see that at the top is what it looks like when the person has no symptoms. That's their baseline. And then this was a patient on a tilt table, and about a minute before they passed out, they're feeling very presyncopal, very, very symptomatic. And you can see the fullness of the heart pulse is very different. It's very much more spurty, as I was mentioning. There's a drop in preload. It's a much more sharper, spurtier pulse. And there's a lot less blood getting to your head. And so this is actually what we're seeing in how our algorithms are tuned to tell the difference between stable, healthy blood flow and a reduction in blood flow. Now, we tested this against many different ways to measure blood flow to the head. This is transcranial Doppler ultrasound. This is using ultrasound probes to go actually through a very tiny acoustic window to try to measure blood flow to the middle cerebral artery. That's one of your, that's one of the dominant sources of blood to your brain. And so we ran a number of studies, and I'll get into this a little bit more later. But when we have a good stable TCD signal, the stat device tracks it very nicely. So you can see the morphology of the black line is the stat device's outputs, and the blue line is the TCD's measurements in the middle cerebral artery. And they actually have a very similar waveform shape. And that changes very similarly when patients have a reduction in flow. And so, yeah. Now, we've actually spent and are spending more of our time trying to actually compare against the technique that Dr. Visser and Dr. Van Kampen and Dr. Rowe have been pioneering, which is, as I mentioned earlier, measuring blood flow to the head using ultrasound probes before going through the skull, because TCD has we've had a lot of issues with repeatability of maintaining a stable reading through the skull while the person's moving and standing up. And so this approach just measures blood flow, and you don't have to go through the skull, and you have a more sensitive and specific way to measure blood flow to the head. And so what we did actually, so Dr. Visser and Dr. Van Kampen are in the Netherlands. I went there a month ago to actually just compare our stat device against their technique. And they've done this technique on over 1,000 patients and they had some of the data I shared earlier. And we actually had some very promising, exciting data where this is the internal carotid arteries ultrasound when a patient was supine. And then when they were tilted upright, this is what their the blood flow velocity through the internal carotid looked like. And you can see when they actually calculated, they actually measure the artery's diameter as well as the flow velocity to get actual volume flow. And so they look at volume flow, and there was a 35% reduction in volume flow in the internal carotid when they were tilted up. So that's a significant, and this patient was very symptomatic. And then if you look at the external carotid, so for us, they actually, so they're very nice. They just were trying to support our research, and they looked at the external carotid and measured flow changes as well as the diameter and area, and looked at the reduction in the flow velocities here as well. So you can see there's a pretty significant drop. And this is what the stat device measured. So this is a stat device when the patient was laying down, and then when they were tilted up, we saw a 30% drop in stats measured blood flow. And you can see the morphology actually tracks really closely to the external carotid artery, which makes sense because this is measured here, and our device is measuring about like a few centimeters up above that in the ear. And so it makes sense that the waveform shapes would look similar. But you can see that when you're laying down versus upright, we can see there's a significant drop. Now that's a true positive case. So someone that was symptomatic, they did have a drop in blood flow. We also looked at a case where one of the doctors actually volunteered to go up on the tilt herself and was supine, upright, same thing, internal carotid, and we saw a very little drop, so only 1% drop in internal carotid flow. And then you can see that the stat blood flow actually didn't change much. There's actually a 0% change in the total flow that we're measuring here. So this is a pretty promising true negative case, and that's actually one of the things we now want to also possibly use statin is we can't be used as a diagnostic right now, but we want to try to help eventually become one. That's one of our goals because we're seeing a pretty promising way to see the difference between someone who's symptomatic versus not, which current metrics like heart rate and blood pressure do not do a good job of.
And then just maybe just to pause for a moment. So really what you're saying is that you're not measuring pressure. And if I understand you correctly, what you're measuring really is the actual flow. So this is really a functional readout, right? So you can actually see that there's less blood going into the head, right? Is that the correct conclusion?
Exactly. So the conclusion is what we're seeing is with someone that's symptomatic and having not like symptoms of not enough blood flow to the head, we see very clearly with both techniques, both the ultrasound here and the stat device, there's a drop in flow. But someone that's not symptomatic, they're upright, and they're not, and we're seeing that both techniques are not seeing a change in flow. So healthy people, there's a very clear abnormality of healthy controls versus people that are symptomatic, and so that's yeah. So we've even before this, so this was a very recent study. We just did this last month, and it was a very small study that now we're going to try to scale to hit more patients, because this is only 6 patients and 1 healthy volunteer, which is nowhere near statistically significant. So we're doing a proof of concept to compare against the technique, and so we'll be trying to expand this work. But before this, we actually did some testing with the stat device at Johns Hopkins during their normal tilt table testing. They were just using blood pressure cuffs and then heart rate using ECG. But compared to those devices, I mean, we saw a dramatic. They can't measure blood flow to the head. The blood pressure cuff failed to take measurements when the patients were very symptomatic and before they passed out, because I think their blood pressure was changing too much for the cuffs to actually register anything. And so, but what we saw with the stat device was a continuous reduction in flow, and this happened minutes before the patient actually passed out. So we published this in JACC back in April this year. I'm going to take a quick moment to talk about our blood pressure trend algorithm. So we're actually going to be starting with a trend algorithm, not absolute blood pressure, because absolute blood pressure, it is very highly regulated for good reason. You don't want to give falsely high or low readings. That's going to, mainly high readings. So you don't want to classify someone as hypertensive if they're not, and give. And so anyways, the FDA regulates that very tightly. So we actually intentionally are not outputting an MMHG score. So the standard, you might think like 120/70 or like the 2 numbers. Instead, we're trying to give a average, so not systolic or diastolic, but a mean blood pressure trend metric that's between 0 to 20. So you can actually use it to compare against existing diagnostic standards, but it's helpful for helping you understand for yourself. I'm normally at like a 9 blood pressure trend, but if I'm actually having a lower blood pressure trend, like post lunch, and I have like postprandial hypertension, you might have that drop to 8, 7, 6. And so that's like some of the way it helps to understand the intraday variability of your blood pressure without, and so that's really what this algorithm is tuned around. And so you can then maybe you'll see it's low, and you can go and corroborate it with the actual cup if you wanted to, but that's kind of our intended use of this. It can't be used as a diagnostic on its own, can't be compared against standards, but it could be useful for helping you self-manage each day. So our future research focus right now is we've been doing a lot, and actually, so this presentation was actually a variant of it was delivered at the Saudi Arabia Internationals Conference about 2 weeks ago, and I actually co-presented that with Dr. Marat Foudim from Duke University, because he actually has been using the stat device during tilt table testing now on like 50-something patients, and so. He actually shared some of his data. I did get his permission to share that data, so I'll get into that later. But we do have a lot more tilt table data comparing the stat device against actual simultaneous TCD during tilt table testing, as well as continuous blood pressure and heart rate. And I'll share that later, but so it's kind of out of order here, so apologies for the confusion. But our future research focus outside of tilt table testing is trying to go more towards active standing, so normal living situations, because tilt table is very artificial. It's not normal. It's not like what you're experiencing on a day-to-day basis. This has already been shown by many, well, Dr. Satish Raj back when he was at Vanderbilt. But you can see that when you tilt up, you have a much more severe heart rate rise than when you're actively standing. There's many reasons for that. One of the main ones is just that you're activating the calf muscle pump and different like muscles, because you're actively holding yourself up. So that helps squeeze some of the blood back up to your heart. But you can see that there's less of heart rate change. I believe they also, I can't remember if they saw the symptomatic change as well. But anyways, heart rate, tilt table versus active standing is different. And we want to be now studying more active standing than all the tilt table testing that we've done so far. So one of the ways we actually do that is we have a stand transition algorithm. We have a very precise way to know exactly when someone is sitting upright versus laying down versus standing up, because we are hard fixed in the ear, which is hard fixed to the spine. So we're very closely tied to and can see like exactly what your body position is. Whereas other wearables that are like on the arm are like confused if they're using many of the technologies to measure can't measure it well because your arm is not fixed to the spine. Now, what we have, so this is actually a ROC curve. Basically, I'm not going to get into this exactly, but this is one of the ways that like data scientists will try to assess how good are you at measuring and predicting that something has occurred. So what we predict, one of our algorithms is predicting the body position. Are you standing versus sitting versus laying down versus walking or running, or false positive, nothing occurred. And you can see that the closer you get to one, the more like when you say something happened, it actually happened. And no test, basically no test is like perfect, but we're getting pretty close to it with with our stand transition algorithms. Now, the way that we actually use this information is we are feeding into a mobile app, and the mobile app gives you ability to see over the course of a day. So you can see how many times you stood up over at any point of the day. So like at 11 a.m. you see you had 2 stands. You can also see your general heart rate and blood pressure trend averages over the course of the day. But then you can click into each of these hours and then click on a very specific stand. So this is my data a while back. And when I stood up at 2:17 p.m. to 2:22 p.m., you can see what my heart rate and my blood pressure trend did upon standing. So I had a slight dip, I had a heart rate rise, it kind of stabilized out. So this is kind of one of the ways that we are actually going to make this data accessible and visible. So you can actually, if you're feeling very bad or on a specific stand, you can actually go back and retrospectively click in and see what was going on in your hemodynamics. Did you have a question?
Yeah, Daniel. So here the blood pressure trend is the blood pressure or the blood flow to the head.
So earlier we had this is part of the UX research. We're trying to figure out how to present the data best, because now we have 2 data points already, but blood flow is actually more important. But do we show all 3 simultaneously? But then we have different axes for each of them. And so we're trying to figure that out exactly. But the point is we do have all the data. We're trying to figure out how to present it in a way that is intuitive. And like for some people, like if you're super, like a lot of people in this community, as we've been interacting and learning from you all, are extremely educated and extremely like savvy with data. But that's not everybody that needs to be helped with this. And we need to be able to create a product that is helpful, not just for the data scientists that have these issues, but also for people that don't know how to make sense of this. And so we have to work on distilling that down. And so anyways, the point is we have the information, but this is one example. This is an old version of the app as well. This is like back in April, so lots has changed. But okay, so on this note, so upon standing and seeing what you actually see in changes, we actually ran back at the DI conference 2 weeks ago. We actually ran a demos where we actually had people sign up for like 20-minute slots. They came by, we brought a cot, we had them lay down on the cot for 5 minutes and then stand up for 5 minutes, because we wanted to see like how's your blood pressure trend, your heart rate, and your blood flow to the head changing upon the stand. And we ran 31 people through it that all had some form of dysautonomia. Mostly all of them had symptomatic symptoms, and we asked them every minute if they were experiencing symptoms. And then we also, before that, on our team, we ran a healthy control data set using the same exact protocol. We lay down for 5 minutes, stand up for 5 minutes, and see what changes occurred. And this is actually some of the data. So actually, this is what we shared this on social media, but you can see that this was actually just the day 1 data, but so about 17 orthostatic intolerant patients or people with orthostatic intolerance. And you can see that there was actually the heart rate rise on first day was actually smaller than the healthy controls, which initially confused us a lot because most of them had POTS. So we were like, what? Why are they having a lower heart rate than us? You can see blood pressure was generally stable, but one of the key things you can see is that blood flow was reduced much markedly compared to the healthy controls. And so you can see here, like heart rate might be deceiving you. If you looked at heart rate alone, blood pressure might be deceiving you, but the blood flow to the head was actually tracking with symptoms. We did look back, we did capture like what conditions they had, what interventions they were on, and basically we went through actually a number of we were forming hypotheses around what was explaining the data here. We initially thought it's because everyone was in a loud environment like on an exhibitor floor, but we moved to a quiet room for day 2, and we still saw a low heart rate rise. And when we look back at the data, basically everyone was on hypertensive on beta blockers, on like heart rate reducing drugs, on 90% of them were on like salt tablets and other forms of like extra salt intake. 20-something% of them were on IV fluids. So they were very prepared to attend the conference, and that is very much affecting some of the hemodynamics. And I guess the drugs are working, right? The drugs are trying to help the heart rate rise reduction, not make there be as large of a heart rate rise, but But you can see that, yes, that might reduce that, and what you're targeting, it's working. These are all well managed patients, but they're all symptomatic still, and what explains it is a blood flow to the head drop. So that was this is actually a study that now we're actually gonna. I actually was driving around today to all of my. We're trying to build our healthy controls data set out to be larger so that we can have it be a better publication, because our healthy controls is mostly males in their 20s. And all of the average age was 35 or 36 females, and in the orthostatic intolerant population. So we're trying to build out our healthy controls to match more age and gender match before you publish. But some of the doctors that saw this at the conference thought this should be published, so that's kind of the route we're going. But anyways, the point is, this is where we're looking at now. It's not tilt table, but active stand, and we're seeing even the SAT devices even in active stand seeing a difference. Now, so all of what I shared here earlier, looking at every single, I think on average, we see like people are standing like 30 times a day. If you had to go and click on every single time you stood up to try to figure out and form a conclusion, that's way too much data. That's way too much work. So we actually try to distill all that data down into a couple of simple scores. So one of those scores is a flow score. So the flow score is basically, we're looking at how you're sitting, standing, and lying down, heart rate, blood pressure trend, and blood flow trend, what they look like, and just integrate that over the entire day, or average that over the entire day. And we can see like if it is deviating from your normal. So this is all relative to your normal, and we're also taking symptom scores. So on days that you have low symptoms, and what's your normal on low symptom days, and see when you have high symptom days, which of these are actually causing and driving that. We believe it's mostly going to be blood flow, but that might be different for different populations. So that's part of the data architecture we're setting up to be able to just figure out which ones map best to that particular user. So there's going to be a little bit of a learning process. But that's the idea of the flow score here is we see what if you have poor flow that correlates with symptoms, we want to be able to know that and see that the flow is dropping before you start to have like a flare up or it starts to get really bad. So it's a pacing score is really the intent of the flow score. We don't want you to overexert yourself, and so that's kind of the idea of the flow score. Now at the same time, we have an up score, which is tracking how long you're sitting upright versus how long you're standing versus how long. We're going to change this to like stepping, not necessarily cardio, but that you're moving around upright. And because we want to encourage being upright more. If you want to be upright more, you have to be upright more as part of the, there's a part of conditioning your body to battle gravity and like practice battling gravity. So this is another score that we are helping keep track of your progress. But we're encouraging up score, but we also don't want to push the up score too much on days that you're having a bad flow score. So these are kind of scores that you keep in parallel. We're encouraging becoming upright more, but not at the compromise when you're at risk of causing a flare up or just you're shocking your body. And so that's these are more of the day-to-day types of scores that you might look at. You might be interested in dive into a very specific stand on a day, but we think most people are going to just want to use this day-to-day score. And this is just, actually a lot of this has changed, so I'll skip over this. So there are some limitations of STAT. So STAT may not detect local flow changes inside the skull. So as I mentioned earlier, the external carotid artery is the one that we're measuring. And when the heart doesn't put out enough blood and it drops the total blood leaving the heart, that's going to affect both arteries. But there are cases where only the internal carotid can have less flow. One of those is if you have a stroke. If you have a stroke in your internal carotid, it's going to block flow. It's preventing blood flow from going in. The external carotid may not see that. So that's an example. Another example, which is fairly common in the POTS population, is when you hyperventilate. One of the things that when you hyperventilate, you're actually like pushing out a lot of the CO2 in your blood. Your body needs some CO2 in your blood. And if you push out the CO2 in your blood, actually your internal, your intracranial blood vessels constrict, they get smaller. And if they get smaller, it's harder to push blood in, so your actual flow drops. So these are known situations where these are affecting just the internal and not the external. And this is where we may underpredict or not see something that's actually occurring. So there is limitations to the STAT device in this, but for most people in this population, it's caused, again, not necessarily intracranial effects, but it's heart effects. Another limitation of STAT is that ears are very diverse. Ear shapes are extremely diverse, and this has been what we've been spending years on. We've been at this for over 3 years now, and the ear problem and the diversity of ear problem is what we spend a lot of time on. But we actually have, so we need to get a good fit in order to maintain and get good signal quality and actually measure that artery well. That's one part, but also, like, in order to be comfortable long-term and left in 24/7 and stable, that it just doesn't just pop out of your ear, that's a very challenging problem. And so we actually have a lot of different size combinations in order to adapt for all of the different ears. And there's a bit of a custom fitting process that needs to occur in order for us to perfectly fit someone to wear 24/7. So it's not as easy as a wearable where you might just like strap on a wearable and just tighten it and make it work. There is a little bit more of a friction to the onboarding process. And we're doing a lot of work there to try to simplify that. But that is one thing that that is different compared to other wearables. And also there's a possibility, I think earlier in our earlier design, we saw seeing about somewhere around 10% that we were having issues of getting like a good fit to meet all these requirements. But we might be better now, but we're still doing more data on that. But like that, there is a limitation that there may be some people that we simply cannot get a good fit for. So I like to be very upfront around, this is a research presentation more than a marketing thing. So that's why we're sharing some of these. So some ways to get involved. So if you're doing research in this space, both in dysautonomia and MECFS, we're very interested in that. We're trying to help here. We're looking at a lot of different angles, from diagnostics, from the self-help, like CGM type experience, to like a remote patient monitor, think like a Holter monitor, but for orthostatics. Like, we're doing a lot of different, pursuing a lot of different paths. So if you're interested in any of these and want to get involved from a research perspective, please reach out to me. And then we do have one person that is looking at STAT for being used in many other applications, such as the elderly falling application. We're actually pushing like that. That's something that Selena is now pursuing. The needs for that are a little bit different than the kind of MECFS pod self-management tool that we're initially prioritizing. So Selena is the person to reach out for if you're trying to want to look at STAT for other applications. And then for people that are interested in actually becoming a user for STAT, we are taking reservation deposits at stathealth.com. So we basically, we're planning on taking formal pre-orders in the fall to ship like now more towards the end of Q1 next year. But so if you just place an order, if you place a $1 reservation, you can join our Facebook VIP group, and I'm like on there and just responding to questions and having conversations with various people there. And so that's one of the ways to kind of get involved earlier on. And yeah, so that's there are some acknowledgements about this presentation. So Dr. Tandri was a Johns Hopkins doctor that initially took a chance on us as a startup like almost a year and a half ago. But they were the ones that ran the first tilt table testing with the STAT device. Dr. Mara Fatim and Dr. Fraser Mills and the Duke research team, they've been doing the data that I'll share in the next slide. That is Dr. Fudim's data, but I'll share that in a second. And they've been helping a lot and just advising. And then Dr. Visser and Dr. Van Camp and Dr. Rowe, as I shared earlier, they just graciously said, come over and we'll test it against our technique. And they spent a lot of time teaching me how to do that technique. And we're going to try to like expand that testing. And they've been a really good research collaborator on that front. And then Dr. Satish Raz has done a lot of research in POTS. And he gave me some feedback and helped in this presentation. And then we, of course, the STAT team, we're a small startup team working a lot of hours, all under market to try to help here. So all under market salaries. So it's there's a lot that we're all kind of putting in to try to make something work here. So hopefully, so I got to just give acknowledgement to them. Now,
yeah, that's great. So maybe we should take a little pause. This was fantastic so far. There are quite a few questions. Some of them I will receive prior to the webinar. So maybe I'll just bring up a few questions related to research, and then we can continue. I guess the first one is: Are there actually other research studies that are being conducted? There's one specific question. Is there a study in long COVID? Are you aware of any studies? It sounds like you are encouraging that, but is there anything that's recruiting for any of those studies right now?
So we actually, since we launched last month, had many different research people. There's a surprising number of top research institutions that are trying to research and figure out what's going on here. And now, like, most of them want to work with us and use our device in some of these studies. So we're actually For those, we're not recruiting actively because they're facilitating them. So I know I'm not sure which ones I can actually disclose right now. Actually, I know, like, for example, MIT. It was one of the ones that are local here in Boston. We're based in Boston that will be helping out with our device. But there's multiple institutions that are looking at long COVID, ME/CFS, even chronic Lyme and other populations. And so, but for us, we are recruiting for various prototype tests, and we do a lot of different types of tests. And we were recruiting for those primarily from we will be from our VIP Facebook group. So that's one of the ways if you want to get involved from ones that we facilitate ourselves, that's the way to get involved. Yeah.
Okay. One other interesting question, is the device powered by solar? And if so, what prompted that?
Yeah, so it actually was prompted, solar was one of the early product requirements because it was initially driven by my dad, who was like, if he has to take out a device every like day or two or a couple of days and put it back in, charge it and put it back in, he's not gonna adhere to it. He's gonna forget to put it in. It's just not gonna be okay. So that's where that's what initially drove the requirement to say, he just put it in his ear and it should just self-charge and he should completely forget it's there. But it's just always there kind of watching and monitoring and helping. And so that's kind of what initially drove that requirement. And so a lot of the architectural things around packaging and how to make it extremely tiny, like, was kind of built around the solar, like, power architecture. And that's something that would be hard to change now. We could change it, but like it does help to make a more seamless, and for some people, like, total set and forget experience. And so if you get enough sun, and so that's kind of what drove it. Is evolution as our target person change, but we didn't want to also take that out because we still want to help my dad eventually. We still want to help the elderly, and we don't want to have a lot of technology friction in order to help. So it costs a lot of, and it's hard to like keep changing architecture. So we're just trying to maintain that and eventually be able to extend that to other populations. But I realize that ME/CFS community, the POTS community, may not be getting very much sun. So solar charging may not be as compelling of a feature for everyone in the community. And we realize that it's kind of an artifact of old times that we still want to retain because we are still trying to help, like, my dad for one. So
Yep, that's a very helps us to understand why you went in that direction. Daniel, so I think one of the key questions that people are asking is ultimately, how would we be using this on a daily basis, and particularly you're very familiar with the concept of pacing, which is really how currently people manage their daily activities. How do you see the device working with pacing, informing people about what to do? What have you seen so far, and what do you suggest?
I mean, so I've looked at a lot of literature, and like there's like various people that were trying to figure out, is there like a heart rate threshold that you can avoid lactic acid. There's like a lot of different hypotheses around pacing. But like, I think I haven't seen anything that's compelling that like the heart rate zone tracking is like a really strong metric for pacing. It may help for some, but it's not very specific. And there's at least I've read a number of papers that there's issues with that approach alone. And so we think that the majority of what's going on here is a shock caused by not enough blood flow getting to your head. So we think that this metric is going to be what's going to be key to like figuring out, if you have a sustained drop in blood flow to the head and you keep doing that for a longer period of time, that's what may cause you to now have your body just like go into a shock and like you're now in a multi-day flare up. That's a hypothesis. We don't know that yet, but our key thing is we think that blood flow to the head is going to unlock a lot more in that. And so that's kind of what we're trying to incorporate into the idea of the flow score, where the flow score is trying to understand that and help you not over push yourself when your flow to your head is not good. And so, but this is all like part of the future research that we need to study active standing. We need to see people in their normal life and before a flare up and see what these metrics show before ahead of time. And so that's kind of our current thinking. But again, we still have to prove that, and like that's not proven yet. We're just at the cusp of trying to develop that the flow as a preventative pacing tool. But those are some of our ideas.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Maybe just a couple more questions. Some of the practical questions. Are there any adverse reactions while wearing the earpiece, and would it be compatible with other headsets and things like that?
Yep. So if you go on the website, stat-health.com, you can see like we intentionally designed it to be set and forget 24/7 wearable. And in order to do that, you have to be able to be worn simultaneously with like all the other things you're going to put in and around your ear, like AirPods, headphones, glasses, masks, etc. So you can see actual pictures of stat being worn simultaneously with those on the website. So we are intended to be that's a key part of the architecture. Like many elements make it 24/7 wearable. It's coexistence with other things. It's the solar charging. It's the comfort, stability, and figuring out the ear diversity issue. All of this work has been like part of what's unlocking being able to leave it in 24/7. But that is our intended architecture.
That's great. That's great. So yeah, I think you wanted to share some more research data. So maybe we'll do that now, and then we do want to have at least some time just for some of the practical questions about when do you expect the product to be ready and how would it work in the real world. But you wanted to share a few more research findings, right?
Yeah. So
Okay.
I mean, this is data courtesy of Dr. Fadim. This is an ongoing study. It's almost done, but we are going to be tying in some of that carotid ultrasound approach I mentioned earlier. So we are going to collect, I think, another like 10 to 20 patients. But the initial goal of the study, again, this is pre-published and it's not yet published data, but I mean, we are going to be publishing this later, is to see how does that compare against the gold standard diagnostic test tools. And these are tools that are not even widely adopted. Like very few clinics do TCD ultrasound. Very few clinics actually have continuous blood pressure monitoring. But we were looking at how do we compare against kind of the more advanced version of tilt-table testing. And then we're also tracking symptoms every 2 minutes to see like how well what we're measuring tracking with the symptoms people are experiencing. So these are some of the devices that we're comparing against. So this is a continuous blood pressure monitoring. It's a dual finger cuff that chokes out each finger at different times to measure continuous blood pressure, as well as a TCD ultrasound I mentioned earlier. So these are a couple of the examples where the black line is the ICU monitor, continuous blood pressure monitor. You can see that there's a slight heart rate, blood pressure rise, and then a dip when the patient passed out. And the green line is the stat device's output. We are outputting at a much higher frequency, so this looks a little noisier, but generally tracks the trend very well. So that's the blood pressure trend algorithm against the gold standard, and I'll show a lot of case examples. And then this is against the ultrasound machine. So the blue line is the TCD ultrasound, and the green line is stats measured blood flow. And so you can see how well we're tracking very nicely with the trend as well. One of the things that you'll see throughout a lot of this is, as I mentioned earlier, TCD is very noisy. It's very hard to maintain a good signal. You can see that a little bit here, but that'll be more clearly shown later. But anyways, the point is these are the things that we're comparing against. One of the things that we were looking at is like how continuous is our data? How like throughout, so what we did was we actually chunked all of the data into 30-second epochs and saw like, are we able to generate at least 3 like heart rate, blood flow, blood pressure trend outputs in those 30-second epochs across all of the tilts. And basically 88% of the time, we were able to measure, like do our advanced hemodynamics. So that's the blood pressure trend and blood flow to head algorithms. And basically 99.9% of those epochs, we had high rate outputs. So just showing that we have really good continuous data compared to TCD, where TCD has good TCDs in 61% of epochs, but this is only 61% because I couldn't create a really good algorithm that could filter out the TCD well. So the black line is actually like what is good TCD data. Every other period we filtered out because it was way too fuzzy to see anything that we were able to filter it out. But this is very generous. 61% is very generous because you can see here that like there's these massive drops that are signal dropout from the TCD, not real, but and so anyways, the point here is look at the continuity of data of the stat device, which is in green, versus the TCD, which very infrequently we have this beautiful like solid black line. A lot of times this looks like the second and the third charts. Now I'm just going to actually go into the case studies here. So this was a stat against the ICU monitor's heart rate output. So black line is black dots are heart rate outputs, and green is the stat device, both 20-second moving averages. And then this is the ICU monitor's continuous blood pressure. And so you can see the blood pressure trend from stat tracking with the mean blood pressure. We see the systolic mean and diastolic from the monitor, clinical ICU monitor. This is a TCD. So TCD again is the black line. You can see the big dropouts again. But in general, when we have good TCD signal, we actually track pretty nicely. So the stats blood flow algorithm is tracking nicely. Like these are not real drops in flow. You don't drop to 30% of your supine flow. These are just signal dropouts. But you can see when it looks like there's good signal, we're tracking decently well. And then this is what symptoms look like over the course of every 2 minutes that they were asked. It's not perfectly timeline because like the timestamps of the symptoms were perfect, but you can see in general, like heart rate didn't have a big rise, blood pressure didn't have a big drop. This person was very symptomatic. The only thing that shows that something is wrong here is the continuous drop in blood flow. And so that's where we're kind of, you'll see this trend in a lot of the data. This patient was a negative, no diagnosis because even though they were very symptomatic because they were only looking at heart rate and blood pressure. Now, this is another example case study. This person actually passed out. So you can see we're tracking pretty nicely with heart rate, blood pressure, and blood flow as well. It's not perfect, but we're tracking the trends and see the critical event nicely. And so we can see this steep drop in both blood pressure and blood flow when the patient passed out here. Just to go through a number of them as there's a lot of them. Here, there's a blood pressure and blood flow drop. Heart rate went down, but pressure and flow and heart rate recovered, but this was more of a vasovagal reaction because heart rate dropped, but your blood pressure and blood flow was still low. And this patient passed out as well. Just go through a few more of them. So blood pressure, this patient also passed out here. Just continuous drop in flow, continuous drop in blood pressure, tracking pretty well with the reference. Same thing here. This person had a big blood pressure dip that we see here. This person didn't pass out though. Whole time their flow is pretty low.
And then and how much warning would you get? So when you look at that, when would you be able to tell that that may lead to fainting?
Yes, I mean, so I think that's where where we started and where our initial work was more around like time before passing out. But now, I mean, we haven't really been looking at. I haven't analyzed the data in that lens. I've been looking at more around like symptoms and flow changes. In our earlier one, we were seeing like minutes before that they had big drops, but like and then this is one of the hard parts around setting a good fainting prediction is like, where do you set that threshold? Because if you set it too high, then you'll keep getting notifications super annoying. If you set it too low, it might be too late. And so that's like research that we have to do to really better understand that and characterize that. Our focus shift hasn't been so much on that as much as like more of the active stand focus that I shared earlier. So our earlier thing was minutes, but like there are some people that we now have seen some that it didn't have a drop on like significant drop happen over the course of like 30 seconds. So it can vary a lot from person to person. But I think the fastest one that happened was like 30 seconds. I think so around that around that scale.
Yeah, which is still very, very helpful. Today we're coming closer to the end of our time. So first of all, I want to read you just there are wonderful comments and questions. I'll just want to share with you that people thank you, that you are going to change many people's lives with this, and you're doing such a great work. A few questions. One is around water. Is the device capable of performing underwater, in the shower? Some people use water exercises. Is the device ready for that?
Yeah, so basically we're making sure it's shower compatible. That's a minimum requirement because 24/7 wearable, you have to be able to wear it and wear in the shower. We believe it should be like when I made sleep buds, that was like submersible in water. And I think we're going to take a similar like waterproofing strategy. So we believe we should be waterproof to like some level of depth, but like that's not a hard requirement. If like later on as we're in production and we find, we can survive shower, but we can't really survive 1 meter submerged for a long period of time, we wouldn't stop production for that. But our goal is like, and it may very well may be, hey, you can leave it in many meters of water for 30 plus minutes. But if that's not a hard requirement, that's a nice to have for us.
Yeah, that's great. So maybe just if you could share a little bit more about the timing. When do you expect the device to be ready? Is it going to be reimbursed by insurance, would be covered under insurance, and maybe whatever you can say in terms of the practical aspects of using the device.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier, so we're going to be taking pre-orders in the fall and then trying to be shipping in Q1. Now it's looking more towards like later Q1 because a lot of our focus is, I mean, we're a small team that like we have limited resources. So we like, if we do one thing, then we're not doing something else. So one of the things that we are now doing is we're doing like trying to do this like more publication, more evidence generation. So like that, like I'm not working as much on production related engineering when I'm doing the clinical analysis or like data analysis. So like, I think like that might be, so right now it's looking kind of more towards like end of Q1 that we start shipping. But that is, so that's like one of the, from the initial like self-use wearable timeline. From a like insurance coverage standpoint, like that's a much longer path that we do have one advisor who is one of the world's experts at reimbursement. And he's been helping us, but like that path is like, there's a lot of evidence generation, and that's like part of the evidence generation we're doing now. Like one of the evidence generations we're doing now is more around like using stat as a diagnostic that maybe doctors can prescribe and have you wear for 2 weeks, and then now they can actually see that something's wrong. Like that is there's a reimbursement path for that that's more clear. And that's one of the things that we're now saying, okay, let's spend some time on this. The reimbursement to say, hey, this consumer wearable, they can wear continuous 24/7 for months, years. Getting that reimbursed is a much harder case because that's not the doctor's judgment, but that is insurers saying, hey, it's going to save us money if we give everyone that has these conditions, like maybe we're going to avoid a lot of hospitalizations, we're going to avoid them just interacting with the healthcare system more. So then maybe we can save money, but like we have to prove that to them. Like we're going to save you money, we're going to improve quality of life. And so, but that's like a much longer, which we're like laying the groundwork for, but that's like a multi-year timeline. But yeah.
Well, yeah, obviously we wish you a lot of luck. There were a few other questions we didn't get to answer today. We'll try to answer some of those. We'll share with you those questions, and of course, you're invited to join us whenever there are more data and more developments with the product and the research that's going on. And Daniel, we're really extremely thankful for you to taking care of your dad, and then realizing that there are other people who will be benefiting from this approach. So thank you very much for all of your hard work. And Ani, I think this is time for us to now close this webinar.
Thank you both. I'll go ahead and share screen again. If you enjoyed this webinar and you'd like to make a donation to help support future webinars, you're welcome to do so at solveme.org/donate. On our screen here are some ways to get involved with our social media community. And of course, you're always welcome to subscribe to our webinars, find future webinars on our website. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.